The ice caught us 40 miles short of anywhere that mattered, and that was how we ended up at the Copper Kettle. I remember being sour about it. We'd been driving since before light, 3 trucks strung out along a 2-lane that ran flat and straight through country the color of old bone, and the sleet had come in off the high ground the way it does in that part of the plains in early spring, no warning. Just a gray wall folding down over the road until the wipers gave up and the asphalt turned to glass. Booker, up front in the lead truck, called it over the radio in that dry way of his. "Weather's got us. There's a town. We take the town." The town was Harlan Draw, and it was less a town than a rumor of one. A grain elevator, a shuttered bank, a gas station with 2 pumps and a hand-lettered sign, and at the far end of the single street, a low brick building with a neon coffee cup buzzing pink and gold against the murk. The Copper Kettle. We parked the trucks nose to tail along the curb and sat a minute with the engines ticking, watching the ice tick back against the windshields. And then Salt said what we were all thinking, which was that if we were going to be stuck, we might as well be stuck somewhere with coffee. There were 7 of us. I'll set the names down now because the names matter to what happened later. Booker and Tran and Salt and Denny, and a kid we called Webb who wasn't really a kid, and me, Cole Renner, 3 years on the team then and full of myself in the way you are at that age, when you've done a few hard things and haven't yet learned how many hard things there are. And Rourke. Sergeant Major Rourke, who ran us, who'd been running men longer than some of us had been alive, and who had the quality that the truly senior ones have, which is that he took up almost no room at all. He came in last, stamping the ice off his boots, and he didn't say anything, and I didn't think a thing about it. The diner was warm and smelled like coffee and griddle grease, and the particular clean old smell of a place that gets wiped down every night by someone who cares. A handful of locals sat scattered at the counter and in the booths, a couple of old men in feed caps, a young mother with a toddler working a plate of pancakes into ruin, a rancher type reading a folded newspaper. A radio behind the counter played something with a fiddle in it low, and there was a woman. She was behind the counter with a coffee pot in one hand and a rag in the other, and my first honest read of her, the read I'd spent a long time being ashamed of, was that she was nobody. 50, maybe. Lean, gray coming into brown hair pulled back plain, a face that had been out in the weather. A name tag that said Dell. She moved without hurry and without waste, and I registered that the way you register the color of a wall, which is to say I didn't register it at all. She was scenery. She was the coffee that came with the town. "Sit anywhere, hun," she said, and that was the first thing she ever said to me, and I gave her a nod that had nothing in it and took the big corner booth with the others. We filled that corner up loud. That's what we did in those days, off the leash and off duty. 7 men who'd spent a hard rotation being quiet on purpose and were done being quiet. Salt started a story before we'd even sat, some tale of a jump gone sideways, and Denny talked over the end of it, and Tran laughed too big at both, and I put my boots up on the bench across from me, and owned the room the way young men own rooms they haven't earned. The old men at the counter glanced over once and went back to their coffee. The mother pulled her toddler's chair an inch closer to her. Rourke sat at the end of our booth against the wall, facing the door, and drank his water and said nothing, and I thought that was just Rourke being old. Dell came over with the pot and a stack of laminated menus. She filled 7 cups without being asked, moving around the outside of the booth, and she never once reached across a man, and she never once got in the way of a hand, and I didn't notice that either, not then. What I noticed was that when Salt leaned back mid-story and threw an arm wide to paint the sky he was describing, his hand came right at her, and she wasn't there. She'd already stepped the half-step that took her out of it, smooth as water going around a stone, still pouring, not spilling a drop, not looking at his hand. Salt never knew he'd swung. I saw it and my brain filed it under waitress reflexes and moved on. "What's good?" Denny asked her, meaning the food. "Everything I make," she said, and there was a dryness in it that got a laugh out of Booker, and she let the corner of her mouth go up a 1/4 inch and no further, and took our orders without writing any of them down. 7 men, 7 different plates, half of them changed twice by guys showing off, and she never reached for a pad. I clocked that too. Small town memory, I thought. Nothing to it. That was Harlan draw at 1:45 on a gray afternoon, the ice coming down, the fiddle on the radio, the coffee going around. 7 of us loud in the corner and a woman named Dell wiping the counter, and not one of us, not one, with the first idea of what we were sitting in front of. The thing about being good at something is how sure it makes you that you can see. We were good. We were, on paper and in fact, among the most capable violent men our country produced, and we had spent years learning to read a room the instant we entered it, the exits, the hands, the man who's wrong before he's done anything wrong. It was a thing we prided ourselves on. And we sat in that diner for the better part of an hour and read nothing, because we weren't looking, because there was nothing there worth our looking, because the only trained set of eyes in that room that were actually working belonged to the waitress, and we'd already decided she was furniture. The food came and it was good, better than good, honestly, the kind of plain cooking that's hard to do right, and the talk kept on, and somewhere in there the disrespect started, the way it always starts, small and easy and not even meant as cruelty. That's the part I've had to sit with. Nobody set out to be ugly to her. It was just that she didn't count, so the manners you'd spend on someone who counted, we didn't spend. It was Denny who set the tone. Dell refilled his coffee and he said, without looking up from his plate, "You've been here your whole life, sweetheart, pouring coffee." And it wasn't a question, it was a placement, a way of putting her on the shelf where he'd already decided she went. And Dell said, "Long enough," and let it go. And Denny took that as an answer, and I saw him not even register that she hadn't really told him a thing. Then Salt, warmed up now, decided she was an audience. He started performing at her bigger stories, the war-faced jokes, the kind of talk men do when they want a woman to be impressed and can't imagine she wouldn't be. He told her, leaning back, that we were just passing through government work, can't say more than that. And he winked when he said it, and the wink was the ugliest part, because the wink assumed she was simple. She stood there with the pot and let him finish and said, "More coffee, government work," and refilled his cup, and the table laughed and Salt laughed with them because he thought the laugh was his. It wasn't. I didn't understand that until much later. I did my part. I want to be honest about it because I've asked the younger guys to be honest about themselves, and it would be a coward's thing to spare myself. When she brought the check, I put down a 20 and a single, and I slid the single across the table toward her separate from the rest, and I said, "That one's for the smile, darlin', for the smile. $1 for the smile from a man who'd have taken serious offense at $1 for anything of his." She looked at the dollar and she looked at me, a plain, level, unbothered look, a look with a whole life behind it that I couldn't see, and she said, "Keep it, hun. You'll want it for the road." And she left the single sitting there, and I felt, for just a second, something I couldn't name and didn't like, and I covered it by turning back to Booker and laughing at nothing. Rourke watched all of this. I know that now. At the time I thought he was just tired. He sat against the wall with his water and his untouched pie, and he watched his men be careless with a stranger, and there was a stillness in him that I mistook for age, and there was a stillness in her that I mistook for nothing, and the two of them were the only people in that diner speaking the same language, and neither one of them said a word. "She's all right," Tran said to me, low, nodding at Dell as she went back behind the counter. He meant it as a compliment. He meant she was pleasant scenery. And I said, "Yeah," and meant the same small thing, and outside the ice came down harder, and a black pickup with a covered bed rolled slow past the front windows for the second time. And Dell, who I now know had counted both passes, set down her rag and quietly turned off the neon coffee cup in the window so the glass went dark, and I thought, if I thought anything at all, that she was saving on the light. The town told me later, the pieces of it, after, when I went back and sat at that counter and asked the questions I should have had the humility to ask the first time. So I'll set it down the way I came to know it, because you can't understand what she did in the next 20 minutes without knowing the 20 years that made her able to do it, and she'd never have told you a word of it herself. She'd come to Harlan draw 11 years before, driving an old truck with everything she owned in the bed under a tarp, and she'd bought the copper kettle from a widow who was ready to be done with it, paid cash, and never once in 11 years told a living soul where the cash came from or where she'd been. She fixed the roof herself. She fixed the walk-in herself. When the Peterson boy rolled his four-wheeler into the draw and shattered his leg, she was the one who went down after him in the dark and set the leg with a splint made of her own broom handle and carried him a half-mile out. And when the county man asked her where she'd learned to do that, she said, "Around," and poured him a coffee, and that was the end of it. They loved her, the town, in the careful way that country people love someone who keeps her own counsel. They knew she went out past the grain elevator before light some mornings and stood a long time facing east and came back with her face washed clean of something. They knew she never drank and never dated and never missed a Sunday sitting in the back pew and never sang. They knew that once, when a man came through drunk and started in on the Ray's girl who bussed tables, Dell had crossed the room in a way nobody could quite describe afterward, and the man had found himself outside on the gravel without any clear memory of the trip, unhurt, holding his own wrist and looking at the door like it had bitten him. And they knew, this was the thing they all knew and none of them ever said out loud, that Dell was watching always, all the time, that some part of her never sat down. They didn't have a word for it. I do. She was standing security on a diner in a town of 200 people every day for 11 years, and she'd never once been thanked for it because nobody knew it was happening. That was the woman. I tipped $1 for her smile. She'd seen the black pickup the first time it came through, an hour before we ever got there, and she'd noted the covered bed and the way it slowed at the gas station and didn't stop, and the way the plate was clean in a county where every plate wore a coat of road salt. She'd have logged it and set it on a shelf and kept it in view. When it came by a second time, slow, during our meal, she moved us, all of us, the whole room, without a single person knowing they'd been moved. She turned off the window neon so the glass wouldn't backlight the people inside. She refilled the old men's coffee in a way that drifted them down the counter, away from the door. She took the young mother a fresh short stack on the house, Hun, that happened to seat the child in the corner booth farthest from the entrance, behind the pie case, behind cover. She did it all with a coffee pot and a smile, and it read as kindness, and it was kindness, and it was also a fields of fire problem being solved by someone who'd solved 100 of them under worse light. We watched none of it. We were the 7 most dangerous men in that county, and we watched none of it. We were arguing about football. The truck came by a third time, and this time it stopped, and Dell set the pot on the warmer and dried her hands on her apron slow, and stepped to the end of the counter where a stretch of open floor gave her the whole room, and she said, not loud, just clear, pitched to carry to our booth, "Fellas, you'll want to slide down this way from the windows. Now, if you would." And Salt laughed. That's the moment. If you want the exact size of what we were, it's in Salt's laugh. This woman had just given a room-clearing instruction with the calm of someone reading a lunch special, and the trained warfighter looked up from his coffee and laughed at her and said, "We're all right where we are, Hun," and turned back to the table. Denny grinned. I grinned. Rourke did not grin. Rourke was already moving. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. Rourke sliding down the bench toward the wall the instant she spoke, before she'd even finished. And I remember thinking in the last idle half-second of my ignorance that the old man was jumpy. Then the door came open with the wind, and 4 men walked in out of the ice with their hands wrong, and everything I thought I knew about who mattered in that room turned over in the space of a breath. They came in fast and stacked, which told me the first true thing. These weren't drunks or dopers, these had done this, they had a shape to their entry. Point man peeled left and put his back to the pie case. 2 came center. The 4th held the door, rear security, cold eyes already counting heads. They wore canvas coats zipped to the throat, and they had that gray, scooped-out look of men who have decided ahead of time to do a bad thing. and the point man had a stubby shotgun coming up level, and the center two had pistols out, and the one on the door had his hand inside his coat, and the point man's voice cracked across the room. Nobody moves, hands where I. And here is the thing I have to make you understand, because it's the hinge of the whole day. We were unarmed, off-duty in transit in a diner in America. Our long guns were locked in the trucks under the ice. Our sidearms were in the trucks. We had nothing on us but forks and coffee cups and 3 years of my own certainty that I was hard to kill. 7 operators, flat-footed, sitting down, 20 feet from 4 armed men who had the drop in the angles and the door. In the time it would take me to clear that table and cross that floor, the point man could empty the shotgun into the room twice. Booker's hand was flat on the table, and Booker's hand did not move because Booker knew the math too, and the math said hold. We were, all of us, all 7, for one long and terrible second, exactly as helpless as everyone else in that room. Everyone except Dell. She hadn't slid down from the windows because she'd never been near the windows. She was standing at the end of the counter in the open floor she'd cleared for herself, and when the door came open she hadn't flinched and she hadn't frozen and she hadn't dropped. She'd simply gone still in a way that was different from the room still. The way the surface of deep water is a different kind of flat than a puddle. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her weight had settled. She was already looking at the point man's trigger finger, not his face, and I would learn later that this is the tell of a certain kind of professional, that they watch the finger, and I didn't know it yet, and I was about to get the fastest education of my life. Easy, Dell said. Just that, to the gunmen, in the same voice she'd used to tell me to keep my dollar, and the point man's shotgun swung toward her, toward the only person in the room who'd made a sound, and he said, "Shut up, lady, get on the." She was already inside it. I have replayed the next 4 seconds more times than I can count, and I still can't give you all of it, because some of it was faster than my eye. She crossed the distance to the point man not in a lunge, but in a kind of low, continuous glide that ate the space before his brain had finished flagging her as a threat, and her left hand came up under the shotgun barrel and drove it toward the ceiling. The gun went off, one enormous flat crack, and the pattern tore into the acoustic tile and rained white dust. And in the same motion, the same single unbroken motion, her right hand did something short and brutal to the side of his neck, and his knees simply stopped being load-bearing. She took the shotgun out of his hands as he dropped. She didn't wrestle it from him. She received it, the way you take a plate someone's handing you, and by the time he hit the floor the weapon was hers and already coming around. Down, everybody down. That was Rourke, roaring it, and the room's civilians hit the floor, and Rourke was up now and so were we, but we were 20 feet and a lifetime behind her, and it was already, though we didn't know it, essentially over. The 2 in the center were turning toward her, trained enough to pivot to the threat, not trained enough for this threat, and she did not stand and trade with them. Which is what a brave amateur does and dies doing. She dropped the muzzle of the captured shotgun and put a single round low into the lead man's pelvis. Deliberate, aimed. A fight-ending wound and not a killing one if the surgeons were quick. And I understood even in the roar of it that the choice was deliberate, that she was clearing a room with civilians in it and picking her shots by a standard I recognized because it was our standard, and she was holding to it better under fire than I'd have sworn any human could. He went down screaming, and his pistol skidded, and Webb scrambled out of the booth and smothered it. One down at the door still, one center still up, and the shotgun was dry or near it, and she read that too. She didn't try one more round and gamble on the count. She let the shotgun drop from her hands even as she moved so it wouldn't foul her, and she closed on the last center man inside the arc of his pistol. And what she did to his gun hand I've since taught to 20 younger men, and never once seen done that clean under that kind of pressure. A redirect, a trap, a short rotation that took the wrist past where wrists go, and the pistol was on the floor and his arm was wrong and he was down on his knees making a sound, and she was already turning, already reading the last threat, the man on the door. He'd had time. That was the danger. 3 seconds is forever, and he'd had all three to bring his own gun up out of his coat, and he had it up now, leveled on her, at a range where he could not reasonably miss. And I was still 4 feet too far to reach him, and I knew the way you know a dropped glass is going to break, that I was about to watch the waitress die. She didn't die. She read his line and moved off at a half step as he fired. The round went past her into the door glass and starred it white, and she came in behind the shot, in the beat where his front sight was still recovering, and she did not go for the gun this time. She'd read something in him the rest of us couldn't, some flicker, and she went for the man, took him off his feet and down, and controlled the gun hand against the floor. And there was one more shot, muffled into the baseboard, and then her forearm was across the back of his neck, and her knee was in the hollow of his spine, and his hand opened, and the pistol was still, and the diner was, all at once, completely silent, except for the man on the floor with the pelvis wound, and the fiddle still going on the radio like nothing had happened at all. 4 men, maybe 9 seconds, and the 7 of us, the finest our country had crossed exactly half the floor. There was a child crying. That's the sound that comes back to me first out of the quiet, the toddler in the corner booth, wailing, and the young mother wrapped around her behind the pie case, exactly where Dell had put them 20 minutes before any of us knew there was a reason. The old men were down along the counter, unhurt, drifted there by refills into the safest stretch of the room. Nobody in that diner but the 4 gunmen had so much as a scratch. And that was not luck. That was design. That was a security plan run to completion by a woman we tipped $1. She was still on the last man, controlling him, and now she spoke without turning her head, and the voice was the same, level, unhurried, the coffee pot voice, and she said, "Sergeant Major, I've got zip ties under the register. 2nd shelf. There's a man needs a tourniquet high on the left leg or he won't make the ambulance." Not Rourke, Sergeant Major. She'd made his rank across a diner in the middle of a gunfight, from the way we'd deployed off that booth, from the one order he'd barked, from something in how he carried himself that she'd clocked while I was clocking her name tag. And Rourke, Sergeant Major Rourke, who did not take instruction from anyone I'd ever seen, said, "Yes, ma'am," and went for the register. And it was hearing that "yes, ma'am" out of that man that finally started turning the thing over in my chest. Because Rourke didn't say "yes, ma'am." Rourke said "yes, ma'am" to about 4 people on Earth, and I was standing there realizing I might be looking at a 5th. We moved then, all of us, the way you move when the shame of having been slow lands and you try to be useful to make up for it. Booker got the tourniquet on the pelvis man's high on the leg where the bleeder was, following her call exactly, because her call was right. Tran and Webb zip-tied the 2 who could still fight. Salt, who'd laughed, knelt by the point man Dell had dropped first and checked his airway with hands that had gone very careful and very quiet. Denny called it in our own phones. GPS coordinates rattled off flat and fast, 4 down, 1 friendly civilian involved, request medevac and law. And I stood for a second in the middle of it doing nothing, because I couldn't take my eyes off her. She'd come up off the last man once Webb had him tied. She stood in the center of that wrecked room, chest rising and falling, not hard, just steady, and she looked around at once, a full sweep, corner to corner, the way you do a final count. And only when she'd confirmed every civilian was breathing and every threat was down did something in her shoulders come down a half-inch. Then she walked not fast to the corner booth, and she crouched by the young mother and the crying child, and the coffee pot voice came back and she said, "It's over, hun. You did so good keeping her close. It's all over now." And the mother grabbed her hand and held it, and Dell let her, and stayed crouched there with a stranger's hand crushing hers while the siren started up somewhere far off in the ice. And that not the gunfight, that is the picture of her I've carried for the rest of my life. Rourke found me by the door. He'd been staring at her since she came up off the last man, and there was a look on his face I had never once seen on it. Not in a hard hide on a bad night, not over a friend we'd lost, never. Rourke looked like a man who'd seen a ghost walk in out of the ice and start pouring coffee. "Renner," he said low, and his voice wasn't right. "That refill, the way she moved off Salt's arm, the way she cleared the room before she cleared the room." He stopped. He was a man choosing whether to believe his own eyes. You watch 1,000 people learn to fight and none of them move like that. You watch maybe 3 in a career move like that. "Who is she, Sergeant Major?" I said. And it wasn't a question anymore, it was a plea, because I'd tipped her $1 and she'd just saved my life, and the arithmetic of that was crushing me. He didn't answer me. He walked toward her instead, slow, hat in his hands. He'd taken his cap off. I hadn't even seen him do it. And he stopped a respectful distance from where she still crouched by the mother. And he waited until she gently freed her hand and stood and turned. And then Sergeant Major Rourke looked at this small, gray-haired waitress in a coffee-stained apron, and I watched the recognition finish landing in him like a round finding home. "I know you," he said, quiet. "I've been sitting here an hour telling myself I don't, but I know you." His jaw worked. "Fort, it was the pipeline, the joint element, years back. I was a young team sergeant and there was an operator they brought in to teach the entry package, close quarters, the whole hostage room problem, and nobody would tell us the name. We only ever got the call sign." He swallowed. "You cleared a 4-corner room blind in front of 40 of us, faster than any of us could follow." Same as just now. Exactly the same. I've told that story for 20 years and nobody ever believed the times. And Dell looked at him for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes. Some door she'd kept shut for 11 years in Harlan draw coming open just a crack. And she said, very quietly, "That was a long time ago, Sergeant Major." "What was the call sign?" Rourke said. "Say it, I need to hear you say it." She was quiet. The sirens were close now. The child had stopped crying. Every one of us had gone still, the whole team, sensing without understanding that we were standing on the edge of something. "Keystone," she said. I felt the word go through the room before I understood it. I was too junior to have been there, but I'd heard the name the way you hear the names that get spoken low in the team room late by the older guys, on the nights they talk about the ones who came before. Keystone. Not a story we told loosely. Keystone was the operator who'd held the breach. Rourke had gone white. "No," he said, but he was already nodding while he said it, his whole body agreeing with the thing his mouth was refusing. "The Valley Op, the compound. The extract that went to pieces when the birds got hit and the wall came down, and there were 60 men on the wrong side of a doorway, with the whole valley closing on them." "Sergeant Major," she said, gently trying to stop him, and he would not be stopped. "And one operator put themselves in that doorway," Rourke said, and his voice broke clean in half on the word doorway, and he let it, he didn't care. "One operator stood in that gap and held it alone, wounded, while 60 men came through at their back and did not leave, and did not fall until the last man was out. 60. They gave that operator's story to the schoolhouse without the name because the name was still working. 60 men walked out of that valley. My team leader was one of them. He was crying now, openly, this granite man, tears running into the lines of his face, and he did not wipe them. Mackie was one of them. Mackie came home and raised 3 kids because somebody stood in a door. I have toasted you at every reunion for 15 years and I never knew your face." The diner was silent. Outside, red and blue light had begun to strobe through the starred glass of the door. "I got out," Dell said simply. "After I'd done my holding, I wanted a place where nobody was shooting." She looked around the wrecked, saved room, at the tied men and the tended wounds and the safe civilians, and something almost like a smile touched her, tired and rueful. "Mostly it's quiet." "And Sergeant Major Rourke, I will see this until I die." Sergeant Major Rourke came to attention in the middle of that ruined diner, boots together, spine straight, and brought his hand up in a salute so crisp it cut the air, and held it on her, and his voice came out steady and formal and thick all at once. "Ma'am, on behalf of every man who came through that door, it is the honor of my life. I didn't decide to do it. My body did it before I could think. I came to attention beside Rourke and my hand came up, and I heard the rustle and scrape as the rest of them did the same. Booker, Tran, Denny, Webb, and Salt. Salt with his face wrecked, all of us. The whole team on our feet and rigid and saluting a waitress in an apron in a diner in a town nobody's heard of. The men who'd tipped her $1. The men who'd laughed when she told us to move from the windows. The instruction, I understood now, that had been her trying to save the fools who were mocking her, before she'd even had to save herself. She looked at us standing there, 7 of us with our hands up, and I watched her weigh whether to wave it off, the way the real ones always want to. And then she didn't. She understood, I think, that the salute wasn't only for her, that we needed to give it, that it was the only way we had to say the thing that was too big to say, that we were sorry and that we were grateful and that we would carry this. She let us hold it. She stood and she took it the way you take something offered by someone who needs to offer it. And when Rourke finally brought his hand down and the rest of us followed, she gave him a small nod, one professional to another, and said, "At ease, Sergeant Major," and the 2 words landed on him like a benediction. I could not hold my salute steady at the end. I want to be honest about that too. My hand was shaking by the time it came down. I had put my boots up on a bench in her diner and slid $1 across the table for her smile, and she had, 9 seconds later, put her body between mine and 4 gunmen without an instant's hesitation, because that was simply who she was and had always been, under the apron, the whole time I was looking right at her and seeing nothing. I have never in my life felt so small, and I have never been so glad to feel it. The law came and the medics, and it took hours, and the ice kept falling. They loaded the 4 out, all 4 alive, which the paramedics kept remarking on. 4 armed men taken down and everyone still breathing. They'd never seen a scene like it, and none of them understood that the mercy was as trained as the violence, that she'd chosen it round by round. Dell gave her statement last, plain and short, and left out every part that mattered, and the young deputy taking it down never knew he was interviewing a legend, and she liked it that way, and I understood by then not to take it from her. We should have driven on when the road cleared. We didn't. We stayed the night in that town, the 7 of us, in the little motor court by the elevator, and in the morning before we rolled out we went back to the Copper Kettle, and she was there, of course she was there, wiping the counter down like the floor of it hadn't been a battlefield 12 hours before. She poured us 7 coffees without being asked. And this time we came in quiet. We came in the way you come into a place you finally understand is holy ground. And we sat, and we drank her coffee, and Rourke sat beside her at the counter, and the 2 of them talked low, 2 old operators, in a language of half-sentences and long pauses that the rest of us had the sense not to interrupt. When it was time to go, I hung back. I put money on the counter for the coffee, and then, my face burning, I took a single $1 bill and I set it down separate, the way I had the day before, and I slid it across to her, and I said, "Ma'am, that one's for the smile." And I meant it this time as the only apology big enough that I could find, turning the ugliest thing I'd done into the truest thing I could say. She looked at the $1, and then she looked at me, that same level look with the whole life behind it, except now I could see a little of the life. Now I knew what the stillness was made of. And she picked up the single, and she folded it once, and she tucked it into my shirt pocket and patted it flat against my chest with 2 fingers. "Keep it, hun," she said. "You'll want it for the road." The same words as the day before, exactly. But they weren't the same words. Nothing was the same. I walked out of the Copper Kettle into the bright hard cold after the storm, and I got in the truck, and I have carried that $1 in my wallet every day since, behind the pictures, where I keep the things I don't intend to lose. I take it out sometimes when I catch myself deciding I already know who somebody is, the quiet one, the small one, the one pouring the coffee. I take it out and I remember a woman named Dell in a town called Harlan Draw, who had held a door once so that 60 men could come home, and who was, on the day I met her, still holding it, still standing security over a room full of strangers who never knew her name. The finest men in the room, That's what we believed we were, walking in out of the ice. We were wrong by one, and she outclassed every one of us, and she'd never once have said so. That's how you know the real ones. They don't tell you, they just stand in the door.